If you've seen this title floating around lately, you've probably also seen the thumbnail. A shadowy jungle, a blurry trail camera frame, text promising a 50-foot man eating dinosaur crocodile, or actual living footage of Mokele-Mbembe, a creature that's supposed to have gone extinct 66 million years ago. None of that footage is real. There's no verified trail camera clip of a living dinosaur anywhere, and there never has been. What you're looking at is a recycled thumbnail template, reused across dozens of nearly identical channels, sometimes translated into other languages and reposted with the same footage stitched together differently, built on a story that was never filmed because it never happened. The Mokele-Mbembe legend itself does have a real history, worth being upfront about, because pretending it doesn't exist at all would be its own kind of dishonesty. Stories describing a large water-dwelling creature in the swamps and rivers of the Congo basin have circulated among some local communities for generations, and Western explorers and missionaries started writing down versions of these accounts as far back as the early 1900s. Several funded expeditions have gone looking for physical evidence over the decades, and every single one has come back with nothing more than second-hand testimony, blurry, unverifiable photographs, or no evidence at all. That's a real cryptozoological legend with a documented history of people searching for it and failing to find anything. It is not the same thing as a trail camera capturing a living creature on film, which is the specific claim these videos are actually making. And that specific claim has no basis at all. But here's what almost none of those videos bother to mention. You don't need a fake dinosaur to make Congo's real natural history genuinely stunning, because it's already full of things that sound invented and aren't. An animal that looks like it was assembled from spare giraffe and zebra parts, unknown to Western science, until 1901, even though it had been walking through the same forest as local communities for as long as anyone could remember. A crocodile so large and so consistently linked to human deaths that researchers spent years trying and failing to capture it. And as far as anyone knows, it's still out there. A population of unusually large chimpanzees, discovered through a set of oversized skulls sitting in a museum drawer, sparking a debate scientists still haven't fully settled. A bird so obscure that its existence was confirmed almost by accident, traced back from a single feather tucked into a ceremonial headdress. These aren't manufactured mysteries built to farm engagement. They're documented, studied, argued over in actual scientific literature, and honestly stranger than most of what gets invented about this region. So let's go through what's actually real, starting with the story that reads the most like fiction and somehow isn't. In the late 1800s, European explorers pushing through the dense Ituri rainforest in what's now the Northeastern Democratic Republic of Congo kept hearing about an animal local communities called the Okapi. Descriptions varied depending on who you asked, something like a horse, something with stripes, a creature that moved through thick forest almost silently and vanished before anyone got a clear look. Henry Morton Stanley, the explorer famous for tracking down the missionary David Livingstone, wrote about hearing of this animal during his own expeditions through the Congo basin in the late 1880s, and for years afterward, European naturalists treated it as little more than local legend, a kind of African unicorn. Interesting to write down, but not taken especially seriously. The person usually credited with changing that was Sir Harry Johnston, a British colonial administrator, who became personally fascinated with the animal after helping rescue a group of Mbuti community members who had been kidnapped and were being taken to Europe to be displayed at an exhibition. In gratitude, and because he'd developed a genuine curiosity about the creature they described, members of that Mbuti community shared what they knew about the Okapi with Johnston. He spent years trying to track one down himself, and largely failed. What he did manage to do was obtain striped skin and eventually skull fragments, which he sent back to scientists in London. When those specimens were finally examined properly in 1901, researchers realized they weren't looking at a forest antelope or a strange zebra variant at all. They were looking at the closest living relative of the giraffe, a species now known as the Okapi, with a body built for threading through dense understory rather than striding across open savanna, and with faint zebra-like stripes on its legs that, as it turns out, likely function as camouflage in dappled forest light and help calves visually track their mothers through thick vegetation. Here's the detail worth sitting with, because it's the part these clickbait breakdowns almost always skip. The Okapi wasn't hiding from the world. It was never lost. Mbuti and other Congolese forest communities had known this animal intimately for generations, understood its behavior, its habits, its place in the ecosystem, long before any European ever set foot in the Ituri forest. What actually happened in 1901 wasn't a discovery in any real sense. It was Western science finally catching up to knowledge that had existed the entire time, just outside the boundaries of what colonial-era naturalists were willing to take seriously until they had a specimen in hand. That pattern shows up again and again across the history of so-called discoveries in this region, and it's worth remembering every time a video promises to reveal something local communities never actually needed revealed to them. The Okapi today lives almost entirely within the Ituri Forest, much of it protected inside the Okapi Wildlife Reserve, a UNESCO World Heritage Site established in 1992 covering roughly 13,000 square kilometers. It remains genuinely rare and difficult to observe in the wild, elusive enough that even now, camera trap footage of a wild okapi is considered a notable capture among researchers and conservationists working in the reserve. The species is so distinct that it occupies its own genus, entirely Okapia, and remains, alongside the giraffe itself, one of only 2 living members of the giraffid family, a lineage that was once far more widespread across Africa and Eurasia before shrinking down to these 2 remaining branches. Its short neck, forest-adapted coat, and near-silent movement through thick undergrowth all point to an animal that evolved specifically to disappear into dense rainforest, which may be as good an explanation as any for why it took outside science so long to catch up with what was, for the people who actually lived alongside it, never really a mystery at all. From there, move to something with a considerably more dangerous reputation. Along the Ruzizi River and the waters around Lake Tanganyika, near the border between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burundi, local communities have for decades described an enormous Nile crocodile, one large enough and bold enough to have been blamed for dozens of human deaths over the years. Researchers eventually gave this animal a name, Gustave, after French herpetologist Patrice Fay began studying the reports and attempting to document the crocodile properly. Fay and his team spent years trying to trap the animal in order to study it safely, tag it, and better understand both its behavior and the surrounding ecosystem's crocodile population. Estimates of its size, based on eyewitness accounts, photographs, and indirect measurements, have suggested a length upward of 18 feet, genuinely enormous, even for a species known to produce large individuals. Despite repeated, serious attempts using large traps and experienced crews, Gustave was never successfully captured. As far as publicly available records show, no one has confirmed its death, which means, depending on who you ask and how long Nile crocodiles can realistically live, it's entirely possible this animal is still out there right now. What's genuinely notable about the Gustave story isn't just the size, since large individual Nile crocodiles have been documented elsewhere in Africa too. It's the consistency of the account over so many years, taken seriously enough that an actual field researcher built a multi-year study around it in a region where human and crocodile territory overlap, along heavily used riverbanks and lakeshores. Fay's team reportedly used custom-built traps, large enough to hold an animal of that size, along with careful observation of Gustave's patterns and territory, and still came away without a successful capture, which says something about both the animal's size and its apparent wariness. A documentary crew later followed the search as well, bringing more public's attention to the case without ultimately resolving it either. That's a real predator, a real ongoing safety concern for people living and working nearby, and a real unsolved question about exactly how large this specific animal actually is. None of that needs a dinosaur metaphor. An 18-foot crocodile that nobody has ever managed to catch is already more than enough on its own. Then, there's a mystery that's stayed genuinely open inside primatology for decades, involving a population of chimpanzees in the Bili-Uele region of northern Congo. The story traces back to wildlife photographer Carl Ammon, who, in the 1990s, came across a set of unusually large primate skulls held at a Central African museum collection. They looked, at first glance, like they could belong to gorillas, except they'd come from an area with no confirmed gorilla population at all, which raised an obvious question about what animal they'd actually come from. Later, field expeditions into the Bili Forest documented living chimpanzees there that were notably larger than typical chimps observed elsewhere, along with behavior that struck researchers as unusual, including reports of these chimps preying on leopards rather than the reverse, ground nesting habits less commonly seen in other chimp populations, and vocalizations that sounded distinct from what's typically recorded among chimpanzee groups elsewhere in Africa. For a while, some researchers speculated this might represent an entirely new subspecies, or even hint at some kind of hybrid population, occasionally nicknamed in media coverage as Bondo apes or lion killer chimps. More rigorous genetic analysis in the years since has generally supported the conclusion that these are still common chimpanzees, pan-troglodytes rather than a distinct new species, but the underlying questions about their unusual size, behavior, and isolation in that specific stretch of forest haven't been fully resolved, and researchers studying the population continue to treat it as a legitimate area of ongoing behavioral and genetic study rather than a settled case. That's the honest version. Not a hidden monster, but a real, still partially unexplained variation within a well-known species, discovered through an old set of skulls that nearly got filed away as an ordinary museum curiosity. One more story worth knowing, because it flips the entire discovery narrative around. In the 1930s, American ornithologist James Chapin was examining items in a museum collection when he noticed something odd about a decorative headdress on display, a single unusual feather woven in among the others. Chapin recognized that the feather didn't match any bird he could immediately place, and he began tracing where it might have come from. That single feather eventually led him back to the forests of the Congo, and to the identification of an entirely new species, the Congo peacock, a genuinely striking bird, and at the time, one of the very few new bird species being formally described anywhere in the world during the 20th century. It's a small, almost accidental detail, one feather in a headdress leading a scientist across continents, but it's also a clean example of how much of what gets labeled a discovery in this region was really about outside observers finally noticing something that had simply never made it into the written scientific record before. Step back from the individual stories and a pattern starts to show up across every one of them. None of these are secrets that were deliberately hidden. None of them involve a cover-up, a forbidden zone, or a creature nobody was allowed to talk about. What they actually show is a region with extraordinarily dense, difficult-to-access rainforest, home to real biodiversity that formal Western science simply hadn't gotten around to documenting, layered on top of deep, long-standing indigenous knowledge that already understood these animals long before any expedition, specimen, or peer-reviewed paper made them official. The Okapi wasn't lost, it was known. The Bondo apes weren't monsters. They were an unusual, understudied chimpanzee population. Gustave isn't mythical. He's a genuinely huge, genuinely dangerous, genuinely undocumented individual crocodile that outmaneuvered every attempt to catch him. None of it needed inflating into something fictional, because the true version was already remarkable on its own terms. It's also worth pointing out how consistently that same pattern repeats across the history of so-called discoveries in Central Africa more broadly. Time after time, the actual story isn't a hidden creature revealing itself for the first time. It's outside observers finally catching up to knowledge that communities living in these forests had held for generations, sometimes centuries, before a specimen, a photograph, or a written record satisfied the standards Western science required to make something official. That's not a knock against the scientists involved, many of whom, like Johnston, Fay, Ammon, and Chapin, did careful and often genuinely respectful work once they got interested. It's just a reminder that discovery, in this context, usually means something closer to documentation catching up to reality, rather than reality itself suddenly changing. That's really the difference between the fabricated version of this topic and the honest one. The fake version needs a dinosaur, because ordinary rare animals don't sound sensational enough on their own. The real version doesn't need to invent anything, because dense equatorial rainforest, covering hundreds of thousands of square miles, some of it barely surveyed even today, genuinely does still hold surprises, the kind that turn up through slow, careful fieldwork rather than a single dramatic trail camera clip. Species new to formal science are still being described from Central African forests on a fairly regular basis, mostly insects, plants, and smaller vertebrates rather than dinosaurs, but real all the same, and each one usually traces back to the same underlying truth. This is one of the most biodiverse, least fully cataloged regions on the planet, home to millions of people whose knowledge of these landscapes runs far deeper than any outside expedition. And there's still a great deal that formal science hasn't finished documenting. So the next time a thumbnail promises footage of a living dinosaur caught on camera in the Congo, you can be fairly confident about two things. First, that specific claim isn't real, and no verified footage of anything like it exists. Second, that doesn't mean there's nothing genuinely remarkable to find there. An animal built like a mashup of two completely different species, hiding in plain sight from Western science for centuries, while local communities knew it the entire time. A crocodile large enough to be the stuff of nightmares, never caught, possibly still swimming those same waters today. A chimpanzee population still puzzling primatologists after 30 years of study. A bird identified from a single feather in a piece of ceremonial clothing. That's the real list, and it turns out to need absolutely no exaggeration to earn the word terrifying, or the word extraordinary, whichever one you were actually looking for.